Throughout history, there have been prophecies that seemed impossible, forgotten warnings, and destinies that no one believed. But time, relentless as ever, fulfilled them one by one. Today, we will explore 20 ancient predictions and their unsettling fulfillments. The foretold fall of Babylon. Babylon. Just uttering that name evokes a mix of grandeur and mystery, a city that for centuries symbolized power, luxury, and arrogance. Its walls, so imposing they seemed to touch the sky, were seen as impassable. The city's structure, designed to withstand any attack, boasted thick double walls and a defensive system that included water canals and fortified gates. Anyone who gazed at its silhouette on the horizon knew they were facing the capital of an empire that ruled over half the known world. However, what no one expected, what seemed impossible to the logic of the time and military strategy, was predicted with such clarity that it still baffles scholars today. Its fall, and the name of the one who would cause it. The story begins around the year 580 before Common Era, when the prophet Isaiah, a man who many considered a mere visionary, and others, a true messenger of the impossible, wrote down some words that, viewed from the distance of time, seemed like a foretelling of an event that had yet to occur. Isaiah not only announced that Babylon would fall, but he also precisely named the conqueror who would open its gates: Cyrus. It is unsettling to think that, at that moment, Cyrus was nothing more than an unknown, someone who had not even been born, or if he existed, was just a lost child in the lands of Persia. What's fascinating about this prophecy isn't just the prediction of the event, but the detailed way it was described. Isaiah spoke of gates that would remain open, of soldiers who would enter without resistance, and of a river that would be manipulated to aid the invasion. And he said all of this when Babylon was at the height of its glory, at the peak of its power, when it seemed absurd to think that it could ever fall to any human army. But let us move forward a few years in time and place ourselves on the fateful night that changed history. It was one of those typical Babylonian celebrations, where royalty and high-ranking officials indulged in wine and ostentation. King Belshazzar hosted a banquet in the palace, surrounded by his nobles and courtiers. The city, confident behind its walls, feared no one. Who would even dare imagine that Babylon could be conquered in the middle of the night? Yet while the king toasted and music filled the golden halls of the palace, the Persian troops, led by Cyrus the Great, executed one of the most ingenious military maneuvers of antiquity. Following exactly the method that Isaiah had prophesied, they diverted the course of the Euphrates River that ran through the city. By lowering the water level, the Persian soldiers walked along the riverbed and reached the inner gates of Babylon, which, incredibly, had been left unguarded and unsealed. The image is staggering. A city suddenly awakens, but too late. The alarmed cries barely manage to break the collective drunkenness. Babylonian soldiers run aimlessly through the streets, with no strategy, no effective leadership. Within hours, Great Babylon, the city that had ruled kingdoms, was in the hands of a foreign king. The magnitude of the event was such that even the victors were impressed by how easily it all unfolded. Historical records of this event do not only come from religious texts. Authors like Herodotus and Xenophon, though writing years later, provide coincident accounts of the invasion method and the city's unexpected fall. Archaeology, for its part, has uncovered clear signs of changes to the course of the Euphrates and alterations to the defensive structures that point to a sudden capture, with no signs of a prolonged siege or massive destruction before the occupation. When one studies the historical context, it is hard not to feel a chill when comparing what happened with the words that Isaiah had written decades earlier. A prophecy so specific, even naming the invader, is hard to fit into the realm of coincidence. Some modern critics have tried to downplay the impact of this prophecy, arguing that the texts may have been altered after the events. However, the oldest copies of the Book of Isaiah, like those found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, already contain references to the Persian king, which largely debunks such skeptical theories. There is an additional detail that is rarely mentioned, but adds an even more disturbing nuance to the story. Once inside Babylon, Cyrus adopted a rather unusual attitude for a conqueror of his time. He did not immediately plunder the city or carry out indiscriminate massacres. In his famous clay cylinder, known today as the Cyrus cylinder, he inscribed a message claiming to have been chosen by the supreme god of Babylon to free its people from the yoke of their corrupt rulers. Some scholars have seen this as a political strategy, others interpret it as a way to justify the invasion, but many relate it to the same spirit of Isaiah's prophecy, where Cyrus is presented as an instrument chosen by a higher power to execute divine punishment. The story of the fall of Babylon has been told in many ways, but when one connects historical documents, archaeological discoveries, and the prophecies that preceded it, it is hard not to be drawn to the sense that invisible threads have guided these events. Coincidence? Later manipulation of texts? Or an authentic manifestation of prophetic prediction? Every element surrounding this mystery adds a new layer of wonder. From the detail of the open gates, to the river strategy, to the precise mention of Cyrus in the scriptures. Everything forms a narrative that seems woven by a mind that somehow saw the future before anyone else. Babylon, a symbol of arrogance and excessive power, fell exactly as it had been foretold. And since then, its history remains a warning, a lesson carved in time, reminding us that even the greatest fortresses can fall, when it has already been written that it will happen. The Empire of Alexander predicted. There are moments in history where it seems that destiny was written in stone long before the protagonists appeared on the scene. One of those moments, perhaps one of the most fascinating and enigmatic, centers around Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king who, in less than a decade, extended his conquests from Greece to the borders of India, defying all expectations of his time. What few know, and what very few understand in all its dimensions, is that centuries before Alexander was born, his meteoric rise had already been anticipated with a precision that still leaves historians and scholars of ancient prophecies perplexed. It all begins with a figure who, seemingly, had little to do with the Hellenistic world. Daniel, a young Jew exiled to Babylon, was part of the group of exiles who lived under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar and his successors. Far from his land, living in a culture that was not his own, Daniel became an enigmatic figure within the Babylonian court. And it was in this context, surrounded by foreign gods and tyrannical rulers, that he began to have visions that seemed to be drawn from a future impossible to imagine. One of these visions, recorded in the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, describes an encounter that seems more like a mythical story than a religious scene. In the text, Daniel observes a ram with 2 horns, strong and dominant, charging westward, northward, and southward. But suddenly, a goat appears in the vision, moving at almost supernatural speed, without touching the ground, with a single prominent horn between its eyes. This goat charges the ram with unrestrained fury, knocks it down, and tramples on it, with no one able to save the defeated beast. Up to this point, it could seem like just another symbolic story, full of animals that represent invisible powers. But what makes this vision extraordinary is the interpretation that Daniel himself receives from a being who, according to his account, was a heavenly messenger. The ram, the interpretation says, represents the kings of Media and Persia. The goat symbolizes the king of Greece. And the great horn that crowns the head of this animal is none other than the first king of that future empire. When one stops to think about the temporal context of this vision, astonishment is inevitable. Daniel wrote it during a time when Persia had not yet dominated Babylon. Greece at that time was a collection of fragmented city-states, lacking political unity and with very little influence on the international stage. Talking about a Greek empire that would overthrow Persia seemed, at best, an exaggerated fantasy. However, years passed, decades went by, and history began to align with a chilling precision. Persia grew in power, exactly as the ram in the vision did, extending its influence westward, northward, and southward. conquering territories and accumulating enemies. And then came Alexander, son of Philip of Macedonia, a young man with boundless ambition and a military talent rarely seen in the history of humanity. What is most unsettling about this connection is not just the fact that Alexander defeated the mighty Persian Empire. The way he did it matches the symbolism described in Daniel's vision. The speed of his campaigns was such that it seemed unreal. In less than 3 years, Alexander crossed Asia Minor, crossed the Hellespont, and in a series of battles that are still studied in military academies around the world, dismantled the Persian machinery. The comparison to a goat that moves without touching the ground takes on a near literal meaning here. Contemporary chronicles, both Greek and Persian, describe an army that seemed to move faster than any logistical forecast could account for. But the prophecy doesn't end there. Daniel also mentions that once the great horn is broken, 4 smaller horns would emerge in its place, each pointing in different directions. The image is clear, and even more so when compared to what happened after Alexander's unexpected death in 323 before Christ. The conqueror, barely 33 years old, died suddenly in Babylon, the very city we analyzed earlier. And after his death, the empire fragmented exactly into 4 parts. Each of Alexander's trusted generals, known historically as the Diadochi, took control of a region. Seleucus ruled Asia. Ptolemy took Egypt. Cassander controlled Macedonia and Greece, and Lysimachus settled in Thrace and Asia Minor. 4 horns, 4 directions, just as the vision had anticipated centuries before. Some might say that all of this is just a coincidence, that the interpretation has been molded over time to fit the prophetic accounts. But those who have studied the original texts in depth, including the oldest Aramaic and Hebrew versions, know that the references to Greece, the ram, and the goat were present long before Alexander was born. Moreover, it is no small detail that even ancient authors, such as the historian Flavius Josephus, stated that Alexander the Great, during his advance toward Jerusalem, was informed by Jewish priests that his rise had already been written in the book of Daniel. According to this tradition, Alexander was so impressed by this revelation that he decided not to attack the city, and instead allowed the Jews to maintain their religion and customs. While this anecdote may be embellished by legend, it reflects how the connection between Alexander and the prophecies of Daniel was already circulating among his contemporaries. Another aspect that makes this prediction even more unsettling is the later interpretation made of it by different rabbinic and Christian schools. For centuries, theologians and commentators have debated the symbolic weight of this vision, its connection with imperial cycles, and the message that no earthly power is eternal, no matter how invincible it may seem. The Persian Empire appeared indestructible until Alexander arrived, and Alexander's own empire, despite its speed and reach, crumbled as soon as its leader disappeared. Archaeological remains, Greek chronicles, Persian tablets, and biblical manuscripts all converge in painting a scenario where the rise and fall of empires seem to follow a script laid out long before. The image of the ram and the goat has become, for many, the perfect example of how history sometimes walks down already marked paths, as if the future were sculpted in words waiting for its moment to become reality. Alexander the Great, that young man who defied gods and kings, went down in history as an unparalleled conqueror. But for those who read the ancient prophecies, his name also represents something more, the tangible proof that, at certain moments in humanity, the boundary between prediction and history seems to disappear completely. The eclipse that stopped Assyria. In the history of great empires, there are episodes that seem like they were taken straight from a fiction novel. Moments where nature, superstition, and collective fear combine to create unexpected turns in the fate of entire nations. One such moment is etched in the memory of humanity through a phenomenon that, at first glance, seemed like just a simple astronomical coincidence. But for many, it was the materialization of a prophecy that had been foretold years in advance: the eclipse that paralyzed Assyria. Assyria, in the 7th century before Christ, was an almost unstoppable war machine. Its armies, known for their brutality and effectiveness, would devastate entire cities, deport populations, and leave behind a trail of destruction that is still studied with awe and horror in history books. Governed by monarchs who considered themselves chosen by the gods, the capital of the empire, Nineveh, was seen as the heart of a superpower that seemed destined to expand indefinitely. But what no one could foresee was that, amidst all that power, a simple darkening of the sky would mark the beginning of the end. The connection between this phenomenon and the prophecies originates with a figure who, for many, was merely an uncomfortable voice within the vast Assyrian political apparatus. The prophet Nahum. His message was not one of hope or comfort. It was an announcement of total destruction, a final verdict for Nineveh and its empire. In his words, recorded in ancient Hebrew texts, Nahum spoke of darkness that would cover the earth, of a day of sudden obscurity, of confusion and terror. His warning seemed excessive for a city that considered itself invincible. However, over time, events began to shape those apocalyptic visions. The key moment came on June 15, 633, before Christ, when a total solar eclipse abruptly darkened much of Assyrian territory. This event, known today as the Eclipse of Ashurbanipal, was recorded not only in Assyrian chronicles, but also in clay tablets, where astronomical phenomena observed and feared by priests were meticulously noted. The Assyrian culture, like many other ancient cultures, interpreted eclipses as direct signs from the gods, an unmistakable warning that something terrible was about to happen. What makes this eclipse more than just an astronomical phenomenon is the social and political context in which it occurred. Assyria was already facing internal tensions, with burgeoning rebellions and an economy that was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The population, worn out by years of constant wars and expansion campaigns, was exhausted. The administration of the empire was upheld by a mix of fear and religious propaganda that glorified the monarch as the mediator between gods and men. When the eclipse darkened the sky in broad daylight, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. According to records, there were improvised sacrifices in temples, desperate pleas to the gods, and an atmosphere of collective hysteria that paralyzed activities in the empire's major cities for several days. Some generals, fearing that the phenomenon was a sign of the imminent fall of Assyria, began to doubt the king's orders. There were desertions within the military ranks and, in some provinces, small groups of insurgents took advantage of the confusion to start local uprisings. King Ashurbanipal, known for his political intelligence and ferocity on the battlefield, tried to control the situation by ordering a series of purification rituals and reinforcing internal vigilance. But the psychological damage had already been done. The idea that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the empire began to spread like a slow but unstoppable poison. In the weeks and months that followed, Assyria began to lose control of several of its more distant provinces, while ancient enemies like the Medes and Babylonians started to reorganize and plan their offensive. What is most fascinating about this story, and what makes it a mystery worthy of deep analysis, is how Nahum's prophetic account fits almost word for word with what actually happened. The sudden darkness, the collective terror, the sense of an imminent divine judgment. It was all there, described long before the eclipse occurred. It is important to remember that Nahum was not an astronomer nor an expert in solar cycles. His prediction was based on visions and messages that, according to him, had been revealed to him supernaturally. From a historical perspective, this event marked a turning point. In the years that followed, Assyria entered a downward spiral from which it never recovered. Barely 2 decades after the eclipse, in 612 before Christ, Nineveh was besieged and destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. The city, which had for centuries been a symbol of opulence and absolute power, was reduced to rubble and ashes. Archaeologists, who excavated its ruins centuries later, found layers of destruction that confirmed the violence and scope of the disaster. What is even more striking is that after the fall of Nineveh, Assyria as an empire ceased to exist. Its culture, its records, and its language were buried under the dust of time. It took centuries before the world rediscovered the tablets and reliefs that told the story of that lost empire. Many modern researchers have tried to offer rational explanations for Nahum's prediction. Some suggest that he may have had access to secret astronomical knowledge, although the accuracy with which he described not only the eclipse, but also the emotional and political consequences it would provoke, remains difficult to explain from a strictly scientific perspective. Others, on the other hand, prefer to keep the mystery open, considering the possibility that, in some way that we still do not understand, the prophet truly had access to an advanced vision of the future. The relationship between astronomical phenomena and human decisions is something that repeats throughout history. Eclipses, in particular, have always been interpreted as warning signs, as messages that invite reflection on the course of events. In the case of Assyria, the eclipse of 633 before Christ was much more than a simple darkening of the sun. It was the psychological trigger for a long-anticipated fall. A sign that, when viewed from a distance, fits disturbingly well with the words of a prophet who, in his time, was ignored and despised by those who thought they had absolute control over their destiny. Today, when we look at the chronicles of the time, the inscriptions on the tablets, and the astronomical records that coincide in marking the exact date of that eclipse, we cannot help but wonder how many other historical events have been marked by signs that only a few managed to interpret in time. The eclipse that stopped Assyria remains one of those mysteries where history, faith, and science intertwine, creating a narrative where the fate of an entire civilization was literally overshadowed by the shadow of the universe itself. The Sinking of Tyre. Some cities are born with a sort of curse written into their destiny. Places that, despite reaching moments of glory and power, carry from their foundations the promise of an inevitable downfall. Tyre was one of those cities, a commercial hub that became the envy of the ancient world, a symbol of overflowing wealth, impregnable fortifications, a fleet that dominated the seas, and a people who seemed to hold control over Mediterranean trade. However, centuries before its definitive destruction, a man wrote with the certainty of one who knows the inevitable. "You will become a place swept by the waves, and your stones and your dust will be thrown into the sea." That man was the prophet Ezekiel. To understand the magnitude of this prophecy and its subsequent fulfillment, it is necessary to go back in time and visualize what Tyre represented in that era. The city was divided into two parts, one located on the continental coast and the other built on an island about 700 meters from the shore. This geographical setup made Tyre's heart almost impregnable. Its walls, which rose to 45 meters in height, protected the population from any attempt of a land invasion. By sea, Tyre's fleet carefully guarded every access. For centuries, the armies that attempted to conquer it ended up failing, worn out by the fierce resistance of its defenders and the natural protection offered by the sea. Ezekiel's prediction was written around the year 586, before Common Era, a time when the city seemed invincible. In his text, Ezekiel not only announced the fall of Tyre, but added a detail that, at the time, seemed unimaginable. The stones, wood, and dust of the city would be thrown into the sea. This image, which in those days must have sounded like a poetic metaphor or a prophetic exaggeration, would eventually take on a literal meaning in a way that no one could have anticipated. The first major blow came at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who, after conquering Jerusalem, set his sights on Tyre. His military campaign against the city lasted 13 years, a long and exhausting siege that became an obsession for the Babylonian monarch. The chronicles state that, after more than a decade of unsuccessful attempts, Nebuchadnezzar managed to take the continental part of Tyre, but the population and political power had already moved to the island. The island city of Tyre remained intact, mocking from a distance the armies that wore themselves out against its unreachable walls. Nearly 2 centuries passed before a new enemy, more relentless and determined, appeared on the scene. In 332, before Common Era, Alexander the Great, on his campaign eastward, arrived at the Phoenician coast and launched one of the boldest sieges in military history. The capture of Tyre was not just a strategic objective, it was a political necessity to ensure control over the maritime routes and prevent possible uprisings in his rear. The situation for Alexander seemed just as complicated as the one faced by Nebuchadnezzar, a fortified city on an island, protected by colossal walls and a powerful fleet. But Alexander, known for his ability to turn impossible challenges into memorable victories, decided to do the unthinkable. He ordered his troops to build a path, an artificial isthmus that would connect the continental coast with the island of Tyre. For this, they used all the materials left from the continental Tyre: stones, beams, wood, and even the dust of the destroyed city. For 7 months, his soldiers worked day and night, throwing tons of rubble into the sea to build a causeway 700 meters long. The inhabitants of Tyre initially believed the endeavor was absurd, and that, once again, the sea and their walls would protect them as always. But as the construction progressed, reality began to hit them with the harshness of the inevitable. The causeway was getting closer, day by day. Finally, when the structure was solid enough, the siege machines and mobile towers began to advance, pushed forward by an army determined to tear down the defenses. The final battle was bloody and desperate. The walls fell after fierce resistance, and Alexander, in an act that many saw as a mixture of exemplary punishment and political strategy, ordered a massacre inside the city. Thousands of citizens were executed or sold into slavery. Tyre, that proud fortress that had defied empires, was left in ruins. The most chilling aspect of this story, what makes it a true prophetic mystery, is how the detail of Ezekiel's prophecy was literally fulfilled. The stones, wood, and dust of the city were indeed thrown into the sea to construct the causeway that allowed for the final siege. What, when written, seemed like a rhetorical image, turned out to be an exact description of what Alexander's military engineering carried out with near-surgical precision. Today, when one looks at aerial photographs of the current Lebanese coast, one can still see the trace of that causeway that connected the ancient island to the mainland. The island city of Tyre, which in ancient times was completely surrounded by water, now forms part of a peninsula that has forever altered the geography of the place. The physical trace of that fulfilled prophecy remains there, visible, as a silent reminder that there was a time when words written centuries before materialized in stone, earth, and blood. Archaeologists, during their excavations, have found remnants of the original fortifications buried under layers of sediment and rubble, a mute testimony to the violence of that siege and the geographical transformation the area underwent. Greek historical sources, biblical texts, and modern research all agree that the fall of Tyre was an extraordinary event, both for the audacity of the military strategy and for the strange fulfillment of that ancient prophetic warning. Some try to explain all of this as a mere coincidence. Others, more skeptical, argue that Ezekiel's account was manipulated or reinterpreted after the fact to give it a prophetic hue. But even among the most rational critics, it is hard to find solid arguments that can ignore the precision with which an event was described that, at the time, seemed impossible. The eternal silence of Petra. There are places that, even in their abandonment, retain an unsettling presence. Spaces where the echo of vanished voices seems to linger in the air, as if the stones themselves secretly hold the last screams, the last laughs, and the last prayers of those who once inhabited them. Petra, the city carved into rock, is one of those places. Today it is a tourist destination, an archaeological jewel that attracts visitors from all over the world. But for centuries it remained immersed in a silence so deep it seemed to have been torn from the collective memory of humanity. To understand the mystery surrounding Petra, It is necessary to travel back in time to an era when this city was the nerve center of a commercial network connecting Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean. Its strategic location, nestled in the midst of impossible gorges and protected by barren mountains, made it an oasis of power and wealth. The Nabateans, a civilization that flourished between the 4th century before Christ and the 2nd century after Christ, mastered the art of controlling caravan routes, amassing fortunes through the trade of incense, spices, gold, and other goods coveted by the great powers of antiquity. However, what makes Petra a fascinating case from a prophetic standpoint is that its grandeur and subsequent abandonment were already foreseen centuries earlier in the pages of ancient texts that few at the time seemed to take seriously. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Obadiah spoke of the fall of Edom, the territory where Petra was located. The words were clear, almost cruel in their bluntness. Desolate cities, permanent ruins, and a silence that would forever replace the bustling markets and celebrations. These warnings, recorded in texts that are now part of the Old Testament, described a future where Petra would be empty, without inhabitants, turned into a refuge for wild animals. What at that time seemed like a threat aimed at a proud and flourishing people, over the centuries transformed into a reality that surpasses any attempt at a simple explanation. The fall of Petra was not a sudden event. Unlike cities that disappeared due to wars or natural disasters, Petra's decline was slow, almost like a process of death, foretold that stretched across generations. The annexation of the territory by the Roman Empire in the year 106 after Christ marked the beginning of a profound shift in trade routes. Economic interests began to shift toward other regions more accessible by sea. Petra's strategic importance gradually but steadily diminished. As trade declined, water sources began to run dry due to the lack of maintenance of the sophisticated hydraulic systems that the Nabateans had constructed with such skill. Droughts and seismic movements worsened the situation. A devastating earthquake in the year 363. After Christ further accelerated the abandonment process, the houses, temples, and public spaces were left empty, covered in dust and forgotten by those who once considered Petra the heart of their civilization. The silence that followed was absolute. For more than 1,000 years, Petra disappeared from the map of the known world. Even the major pilgrimage and trade routes avoided passing near its ruins. The desert sands began to cover its access paths. The city that had once been full of life and color was reduced to a collection of rocky shapes that only the local Bedouins knew of and avoided mentioning. What is most unsettling is that this abandonment coincides point by point with the ancient prophecies. Descriptions of a desolate place inhabited only by foxes, owls, and other desert creatures fit with disturbing accuracy the landscape that Western explorers found when rediscovering Petra in the 19th century. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, the Swiss man who, in 1812, managed to infiltrate disguised as an Arab to view the ruins for the first time, described a ghostly landscape, a dead city where the facades carved into the rock seemed to silently watch the intruders. The question that still lingers in the air is how it was possible that, centuries earlier, when Petra was brimming with life and prosperity, anyone could have foreseen its ultimate fall. The prophecies were not written in a context where the city's destruction was imminent. On the contrary, they were proclaimed at times of plenty, when no one could have imagined that such an important trade center would end up as a stone cemetery. Some modern scholars attempt to offer rational explanations. They speak of a possible observation of political tensions, the fragility of economies based solely on land trade, or the vulnerability of hydraulic systems in an arid region. However, even under these interpretations, the coincidence with the prophetic content remains too precise to be overlooked. Beyond the theories, the concrete fact is that Petra remained invisible to the world for more than a millennium, a period in which other cities rose, grew, and fell. Meanwhile, the city of the Nabateans, the jewel of the desert, remained frozen in time, as if an invisible force had deliberately removed it from human history. Today, as thousands of tourists walk through the Sikh, that narrow gorge leading to the majestic facade of the treasury, few are aware that they are stepping on a place that was the subject of one of the darkest and most precise prophecies of antiquity. The stones, silent witnesses of that lost splendor, remain there, marked by the wind and the sun, silently observing the comings and goings of the curious who arrive each year. The story of Petra, more than just an archaeological ruin, is the tangible evidence that sometimes the words written on ancient scrolls end up materializing in an inevitable way. The prophecy about its fall not only came true, but it left a permanent scar on the landscape of Jordan. And although today the city has once again welcomed visitors, the echo of its eternal silence remains the main protagonist of this mystery that spans the centuries. The ruin of the Temple of Jerusalem. There are moments in history when the words spoken by a single person seem to hang suspended in time, floating in the air like an invisible threat, waiting for the exact day when they will come to pass. The destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem is one of those instances where the line between prophecy and historical reality becomes so thin that, even today, it is impossible to speak of this event without feeling a certain shiver. A tale of anticipation and tragedy, engraved in the collective memory of millions, that, even in our days, continues to be a source of awe and reflection. It all began around the year 30 of our era, when a Jewish preacher, known for his uncomfortable teachings and his ability to attract crowds, walked the streets of Jerusalem. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. As his followers marveled at the magnificence of the temple, astonished by its columns, its gold-covered facade, and its enormous stone blocks, he uttered a statement that seemed impossible to grasp at the time. Not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. A claim that, for anyone who had seen that building, was unthinkable. The Second Temple was more than just a place of worship. It represented the identity, pride, and hope of the Jewish people. It had been rebuilt centuries earlier after the return from Babylonian exile, and, under the rule of Herod the Great, it had been expanded and beautified to become one of the most impressive architectural complexes in the ancient world. Its plaza, now known as the Temple Mount, was the heart of Jerusalem's religious and political life. Any visitor was struck by its grandeur, the blinding shine of its walls under the Palestinian sun, and the constant flow of pilgrims arriving from all parts. When Jesus spoke those words, he did not do so in a context of war or imminent threat. Yes, Rome controlled the region, but the temple continued to function at full speed. The ceremonies, the sacrifices, and the festivals went on without interruption. For that reason, the warning sounded like an exaggeration, more a symbolic message than a literal prediction. However, history had a twist in store of epic proportions that would transform those words into a dark fulfillment. 4 decades later, in the year 70, Jerusalem witnessed one of the most devastating episodes in its existence. The tension between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire had been steadily increasing. Rebellions, abusive taxes, ideological and religious conflicts, all created an unbearable atmosphere that ultimately led to the Great Jewish Revolt. Rome, known for its limited patience and brutal response to any challenge, sent one of its most feared generals, Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian. The siege began in the spring of that year. The Roman legions surrounded the city, cut off the supply of water and food, and built a containment wall to prevent any attempt at escape. The inhabitants of Jerusalem, trapped within the walls, endured conditions bordering on hell: hunger, disease, internal violence. The historian Flavius Josephus, a first-hand witness of those days, describes in his chronicles scenes of cannibalism, street fights between different factions, and a despair that led many to prefer death over surrender. But the most shocking event took place in August, when the troops of Titus finally managed to break through the defenses. The entry into the city was chaotic and bloody. Thousands of people died in the streets. The temple, the epicenter of all spiritual life in Jerusalem, was invaded by Roman soldiers. Despite Titus's initial orders to preserve the building, the uncontrollable fury of the troops, combined with the chaos of battle, led to the inevitable. The fire spread uncontrollably, consuming the internal wood and melting the gold ornaments. The image of the temple burning was etched into the memory of the few survivors. The Romans, in their attempt to recover the gold that had melted into the cracks of the stones, began dismantling it block by block. They dug, tore down, and moved every section until they were sure no trace of value remained hidden. What had once been an imposing structure, visible from miles around, was reduced to a pile of scattered rubble. The prophecy of Jesus, which many had taken as a mere metaphor, had been fulfilled with almost chilling precision. Literally, not one stone was left upon another. The only parts that survived were some external retaining walls, like the well-known Western Wall, which was not part of the structural building of the temple itself. From that moment on, the history of Jerusalem changed forever. The city was razed, its inhabitants massacred or sold into slavery, and the Jewish people began a long and painful process of dispersion that would last for centuries. The trauma of the temple's destruction became a symbol of loss and deferred hope. To this day, generations continue to remember that event through rituals, prayers, and commemorations. From a historical perspective, the fall of the Second Temple is seen as the logical result of a series of political and military tensions. However, from a broader viewpoint, it is impossible to ignore the strange coincidence between the announcement made decades earlier and the exact unfolding of events. The connection between prophecy and final outcome remains one of those episodes that sends a chill even through the most skeptical. Flavius Josephus's account, which also had personal reasons for narrating the events in such detail, provides a wealth of data that has been invaluable to modern archaeologists. Excavations in Jerusalem have revealed layers of destruction that perfectly match his description. Remnants of projectiles fired by Roman catapults, fragments of burned walls, and large blocks displaced from their original positions stand as silent witnesses to that catastrophe. Perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of this case is the way the prophecy survived through time. It was not written after the events, nor modified by later editors. The Gospels, which record the words of Jesus, were written years before Titus began his military campaign. Jesus' own disciples, in their letters and accounts, referred to this prediction as a warning of what was to come. Today, more than 2,000 years later, the image of Jerusalem without its temple remains an open wound in the memory of a people. The pilgrims who approach the Western Wall carry in their prayers the echo of that prophecy. The stones, silent witnesses of the devastation, remain in place, reminding everyone that there was a time when someone, with an impossible certainty, predicted that even the most imposing structure could not withstand the inevitable weight of fate. The ruin of the Temple of Jerusalem is not just another chapter in Roman military history, nor an anecdote within the chronicles of antiquity. It is, for many, proof that sometimes words can become invisible knives that cut through time with precision where least expected. The fallen Pharaoh in Babylon. The history of Egypt is often shrouded in grandeur and mystery. Pyramids that defy the passage of time, mummified pharaohs that seem to sleep eternally in secret chambers, and a civilization that for centuries was synonymous with absolute power. But among all the stories of the pharaohs, there is one that stands out not for its splendor, but for the dark and humiliating end faced by one of its last rulers. Hophra, known in biblical texts as the pharaoh condemned to fall into the hands of his enemies and die far from his land. A fate that, according to the prophet Jeremiah, was sealed long before the Egyptian monarch became aware of it. It was the 6th century. Before Christ, a tumultuous period in which the powers of the region, especially Egypt and Babylon, competed for control over the territories of the Levant. Judah, the small kingdom where Jerusalem was located, was a strategic piece in this political and military chess game. For years, the kings of Judah oscillated between temporary alliances with one empire or the other, trying to survive in the midst of a conflict that seemed endless. In this context of betrayals and unstable pacts, Jeremiah, the prophet who often spoke against the arrogance of his own people and foreign powers, issued a warning that many of his time considered almost an act of madness. He proclaimed that Hophra, the pharaoh then ruling Egypt, would be handed over to his enemies, just as King Zedekiah of Judah had fallen before Nebuchadnezzar, the feared Babylonian monarch. Jeremiah's words were not ambiguous. He spoke of defeat, capture, and death, far from the lands of the Nile. A sentence that defied all political logic. Egypt remained a considerable military power. Its army, though no longer the one that had dominated centuries earlier, still commanded respect from its allies and fear from its enemies. No one in their right mind could imagine that the pharaoh would fall in the way that Jeremiah had foretold. But history, once again, took a turn as unexpected as it was inevitable. During the military campaign in which Nebuchadnezzar advanced over the southern territories, Hophra's forces attempted to intervene to protect Jerusalem and prevent Babylonian domination from expanding further. The maneuver failed. The Egyptians retreated, and Jerusalem eventually fell under the siege we have described elsewhere in this story. What few know is that this defeat was only the beginning of Hophra's personal and political tragedy. Internally, the pharaoh began to face discontent from his own people. Military defeats and economic crises undermined his popularity. Egyptian officials, tired of a policy that seemed to be leading the country to disaster, began to secretly conspire. It was then that a key figure appeared in this mystery. Amasis, an ambitious general who, seeing an opportunity to rise, organized a coup that soon turned into a civil war. Hophra was deposed and, in a desperate attempt to regain power, sought help from his allies, but it was already too late. Historical records, especially those of Herodotus, tell us that Hophra was delivered to his enemies, imprisoned, and ultimately executed under circumstances that remain uncertain to this day. Some scholars claim he was strangled, others assert that he died in prison due to inhumane conditions. But what is beyond dispute is that he died far from the throne, powerless, dishonored, and without the dignity his title as pharaoh would have granted him. From an archaeological perspective, inscriptions confirming the violent end of his reign have been found. Egyptian documentation, which typically tended to glorify its monarchs even in defeat, was especially terse and cold when speaking of Hophra, as if he had been erased from official memory. His tomb, if one was ever built, has never been found. A terrible irony for an Egyptian king, whose normal fate would have been to rest beneath imposing monuments and elaborate ceremonies. The fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy has been analyzed for generations. The precision with which he predicted Hophra's personal downfall, his military defeat, and his death at the hands of enemies, never to return to rule from the Nile, remains a topic that sparks debate among historians and theologians. Some attempt to explain Jeremiah's prediction as a logical consequence of political analysis of his time. They argue that the prophet, well informed about the geopolitical movements, simply deduced what would happen. However, when the tone of the message and its context are reviewed, the impression left is that of a warning that went far beyond any rational calculation. The case of Hophra also exposes a historical dynamic that repeats at different times and places: the arrogance of the powerful in the face of warnings they dismiss. The pharaoh believed he was safe, protected by the weight of tradition and the symbolism of his office. He was unable to interpret the signs, nor to listen to the voices warning of an inevitable end. Today, as we review the few sources that have survived this chapter, it is easy to feel that there are uncomfortable gaps in the narrative. What exactly happened during his final days? Was Hophra, while imprisoned, aware of the prophecy that condemned him? Did he regret not paying attention to what seemed like a distant threat? The lack of answers makes this story a mystery that remains open. The fall of Pharaoh Hophra, the king who was humiliated and murdered far from his throne, is not just another episode in the conflicts between Egypt and Babylon. It is a reminder that warnings are sometimes not metaphors or exaggerations. They are premonitions that wait for the exact moment to be fulfilled. The story of Hophra, erased from monuments but written in the pages of a book that has survived empires, remains one of the most compelling proofs that, at certain times, the fate of men is already sealed long before they themselves understand it. The flood that erased Nineveh. There are cities whose fall has been so swift and definitive that, even centuries later, it is still hard to understand how such a great power center could disappear so abruptly. Nineveh is one of those cases that defy all logic. Capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire, a symbol of a feared war machine and dazzling wealth, it was wiped off the map in a way that, at the time, seemed impossible. What is most baffling is that long before this happened, someone had already written its fate with chilling precision. The prophet Nahum, whose figure remained shrouded in mystery due to the scarcity of biographical data, was the one who pronounced the sentence that would forever mark Nineveh. His message, conveyed in the form of a war poem filled with brutal images, spoke of total destruction, of walls collapsing, and of a city that would be flooded by its own waters. When one reads these lines and compares them to the events that occurred more than half a century later, it is inevitable to stop and wonder how such a specific prediction could come true with such accuracy. To understand the magnitude of the prophecy and its fulfillment, one must first understand what Nineveh represented in the ancient world. Located on the banks of the Tigris River, in what is now Iraq, it was a city overflowing with power and sophistication. Its walls, more than 20 meters high, protected a perimeter of over 12 kilometers. Inside, palaces decorated with reliefs narrated the military victories of Assyrian kings. The streets were filled with life, with merchants, artisans, soldiers, and officials who were part of a political and military system that seemed invincible. For decades, Nineveh was the heart of terror for its enemies. Assyrian military campaigns were synonymous with extreme violence, relentless conquests, and mass deportations. The memory of its cruelty was etched in the stories of neighboring peoples who, generation after generation, taught their children to fear the name of Assyria. And yet, in the year 612 before Christ, it all came to an end in the most unexpected way. A coalition of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians decided to put an end to Assyrian power once and for all. What began as a prolonged siege, with conventional military strategies, found an unexpected ally: nature. The Babylonian chronicles, along with the most recent archaeological discoveries, reveal that during the siege, a sudden flood of the Tigris River caused the collapse of a significant portion of Nineveh's walls. The flood not only brought down the city's physical defenses, but it also spread panic among its inhabitants and defenders. The waters, laden with mud and debris, flooded the streets and swept away internal buildings. What seemed like an impregnable fortress was overnight exposed and vulnerable. The enemy armies wasted no time in seizing the opportunity. Once the breaches were opened, the invading forces entered with unleashed fury. The resistance was brief and chaotic. Ancient accounts describe scenes of looting, fires, and violence that erased centuries of Assyrian splendor in one blow. Temples were plundered, palaces set on fire, and royal archives, those that held the records of past glory, were reduced to ashes. From an archaeological standpoint, the remnants of that disaster are undeniable. Excavations in the Kuyunjik area, where the ruins of Nineveh are located, have revealed layers of river sediment mixed with remains of fire destruction. A double impact that perfectly matches what is described in Nahum's prophecy: water and fire as instruments of final punishment. What is most unsettling about this story is how, for centuries, Nineveh disappeared from collective memory. Unlike other ancient cities that managed to rebuild after their falls, Nineveh never rose again. During the classical era, the Greeks and Romans barely knew of its existence. It was only in the 19th century, thanks to the archaeological expeditions of Austen Henry Layard and other British explorers, that the world learned of that forgotten metropolis. When archaeologists dusted off the remains of its palaces and walls, they found physical evidence of the violence of its destruction. Fragments of projectiles, layers of ash, and clear signs of a sudden flood that affected the adobe structures. The texts found on cuneiform tablets, many of them written just before the fall, reflect the bewilderment and terror that gripped the population during those final days. From a historical perspective, some argue that Nineveh's collapse was the inevitable result of a series of political and military mistakes. They point out that Assyria had accumulated too many enemies, and that its internal decay was already evident before the siege. However, the detail of the flood, the literal fall of the walls due to water, and the parallelism with Nahum's words remain difficult to overlook. It is not just a coincidence between a natural phenomenon and an isolated prediction. What is striking is the precision of the elements described in the prophecy. The collapse of the walls, the breach of the waters, the internal chaos, and the fire destruction that followed. All conveyed in a poetic language, but with such accuracy that its true meaning only emerges when contrasted with the archaeological facts. Some researchers have suggested that Nahum, due to his knowledge of the region, may have anticipated the risk that the river posed to the city. Perhaps he had observed the wear on the defenses, or was familiar with the patterns of the Tigris's floods. However, none of these hypotheses fully explain why a prophecy uttered so many years earlier was so specific in details about the mechanism of destruction. Today, when one walks through the museums where the remains of Nineveh are displayed, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of its disappearance. Giant sculptures of winged bulls, reliefs showing scenes of hunting and warfare, and fragments of texts narrating the glory of an empire that thought it was eternal, contrast with the silence that remained after its fall. The story of Nineveh is not just the tale of a city that fell due to an alliance of enemies. It is a testimony of how a forgotten warning ended up coming true with a violence that no one was able to stop. The flood that erased Nineveh was not a mere geographical accident. It was the final chapter of a fate that, it seems, had already been written long before the first enemy soldier approached its walls. Moab and the Ghost Town. On the map of the ancient kingdoms of the Middle East, there was a territory that, for centuries, represented resistance, tribal pride, and an almost eternal enmity with Israel. Moab, a mountainous kingdom located to the east of the Dead Sea, whose cities seemed like defiant stone fortresses, set upon arid plateaus, surrounded by cliffs and ravines impossible to scale. For generations, the Moabites were protagonists and antagonists in the tales of wars, pacts, and betrayals that marked the region's history. But among all the cities of Moab, there was one that shone with particular intensity before falling into absolute oblivion: Dibon, known in antiquity as Dibon. The history of Moab is a blend of heroic episodes and constant political tensions. Biblical texts recount various conflicts between Israel and Moab, from the time of the judges to the days of the kings. The enmity between the two peoples was so intense that several Hebrew prophets dedicated particularly harsh words against the Moabites. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah, each in their moment, spoke of the catastrophic future that awaited Moab. The prophecies agreed on one essential point: the cities would be left empty, deserted, transformed into no man's land, and the voices that once filled their streets would be silenced forever. Dibon, the capital of the kingdom during a key period of its history, was the administrative, military, and religious heart of Moab. The ruins we now know as Dibon are situated atop a hill, from where the entire surrounding valley could be monitored. This strategic location, which was its greatest strength for centuries, ended up being the scene of its eternal solitude. The prophecy about Moab mainly recorded in chapter 15 of the book of Isaiah and in chapter 48 of Jeremiah, is especially graphic. It speaks of cities weeping, of empty streets, of cries that fade at sunset. Jeremiah, in particular, dedicates more than an entire chapter to describing, one by one, the places that would be reduced to ruins. Among these names is Dibon, mentioned as one of the points that would be reached by divine judgment. The image it conveys is that of a territory condemned to the most absolute desolation. Over the centuries, the words that once seemed excessive or typical of prophetic rhetoric became a detailed description of what actually occurred. The fall of Moab was not the result of a single conflict. It was a series of stages of decline. After the constant clashes with Israel came the Assyrian raids and later, the Babylonian conquests. Each war left open wounds that never fully healed. The final blow came when the Nabateans, a nomadic people turned into a commercial powerhouse, expanded northward and ended up occupying the former lands of Moab. Dibon was abandoned. The population that had not died in the conflicts or emigrated to safer areas either assimilated into the new rulers or vanished without a trace. The city, once full of life, sank into a silence that seemed definitive. What is most striking about this case is that for more than 2,000 years, Dibon remained an authentic ghost town. Travelers passing nearby avoided stopping for too long. The desert sands partially covered the remains of its buildings, as if nature itself wanted to erase all trace of what had happened there. It was not until the 19th century that Western archaeologists began to take an interest in those solitary hills. In 1868, Charles Warren, a British officer, made one of the most important discoveries related to Moab: the Mesha Stele. This basalt block, written in Moabite language, recorded the local version of some of the conflicts narrated in the Bible, including the wars between Moab and Israel. The discovery was crucial because, for the first time, it offered a direct voice from the Moabites themselves. However, beyond the historical value of the text, what caught the attention of many researchers was the coincidence between the cities mentioned in the stele and those that, centuries earlier, Jeremiah had included in his list of condemned places. The contrast between the proud account of Mesha, the Moabite king who celebrated his victories, and the reality that archaeologists found at the site could not be more eloquent. Where there had once been fortresses, plazas, and temples, now only collapsed walls, fragments of pottery, and tombs looted by time remained. Excavations carried out in the 20th century and more recent research in the 21st have confirmed that Dibon, and generally all the major cities of Moab, were not rebuilt after their final destruction. Unlike other enclaves in the region that managed to be reborn or at least reused by later cultures, the Moabite cities were left in a state of permanent abandonment, thus literally fulfilling the words that had been proclaimed centuries earlier as a final sentence. Some attempt to explain this disappearance with geographical or economic reasons. The lack of water, resource depletion, or the loss of commercial relevance after the rise of alternative routes are frequent arguments among the more skeptical scholars. But even accepting these explanations, the accuracy with which the cities that would eventually be empty were named one by one remains hard to ignore. The case of Moab, and particularly that of Dibon, is one of those examples where archaeology, history, and ancient prophecies intersect in a disturbing way. The eternal silence that now surrounds the hills of Jordan, where the city once stood, seems to be part of a script written long before the Assyrian or Babylonian armies decided to march on its gates. Those who visit the ruins today often walk along dusty paths, unaware that they are stepping on a place that was the subject of a curse pronounced more than 2,500 years ago. A site that, at its time, was the beating heart of a kingdom, and now remains as a petrified testimony that sometimes words have the power to shape the fate of nations. The ghost town of Moab, reduced to rubble and dust, remains there. Its stones, worn by wind and time, seem to whisper silently that everything that was said, ultimately came to pass. Sidon and the Silent Curse. Sidon, that word in the ancient world that evoked images of ships laden with exotic goods, bustling markets by the sea, and temples dedicated to Phoenician gods who, for centuries, seemed to smile upon the prosperity of the city. A city that, like many others in the region, was witness to and protagonist of alliances, betrayals, wars, and moments of commercial splendor that were difficult to match. But behind this vibrant and cosmopolitan image, there was something more. A shadow, a sentence that many ignored and that, little by little, enveloped Sidon in a fate from which it never fully escaped. Unlike Tyre, its neighboring and historical rival, Sidon was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event. There was no Alexander the Great tearing down its walls, or a flood erasing it from the face of the earth. The curse that fell upon Sidon was different, slower, more silent, but equally devastating. A form of progressive corrosion that, over the centuries, weakened it from the inside, reducing it from a commercial powerhouse to a shadow of what it once was. The prophecy that foretold Sidon's dark fate can be found in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 28. There, the prophet, in a firm and cutting tone, warns that Sidon would be punished with epidemics, internal violence, and that its inhabitants would end up wounded and spilling blood within its own walls. He did not speak of a sudden external invasion, but of a kind of slow agony, marked by daily suffering and the certainty that the city's glory would never return. When reviewing the later history of Sidon, the coincidence between the prediction and the events is unsettling. The city, though it survived the great disasters that affected other Phoenician cities, entered a downward spiral that seemed endless. Over the following centuries, it was the scene of internal uprisings, massacres, and persecutions. Every attempt at recovery was thwarted by social conflicts, disease outbreaks, or political decisions that pushed its inhabitants toward despair. One of the most representative episodes of this gradual decline occurred during Persian rule. While Tyre managed to maintain some degree of autonomy, Sidon became trapped in a relationship of subjugation that eventually took its toll. In 351, before Christ, when the Sidonians attempted to rebel against Persian control, the repression was brutal. Thousands of inhabitants were killed, and according to some sources, many others preferred to set fire to their own homes rather than surrender to their enemies. The city burned for days. The smoke from that tragedy rose over the Mediterranean as a reminder that something was breaking once and for all. But the misfortunes didn't end there. Over the centuries, Sidon passed from hand to hand. Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders. Each new ruler seemed to extract a little more life from the place. Epidemics, often documented in historical texts of the region, frequently struck its population. Plagues, cholera, and typhoid fever turned the city into a point of recurring pain within the medical chronicles of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Archaeological records reinforce this image of prolonged decay. Excavations carried out in recent decades have uncovered remnants of entire neighborhoods, suddenly abandoned, layers of ash from fires caused during internal rebellions, and cemeteries showing a notable increase in mass burials during specific periods, especially during times of epidemic outbreaks. Walking through the streets of modern Sidon, located in present-day Lebanon, it is difficult to imagine that this small urban core was once one of the great commercial centers of the Phoenician world. Activity, though present, lacks the magnitude and prestige of its past. The modern city coexists with its ruins, as if both temporal dimensions overlapped in an attempt to remind each step that there was once a time when Sidon was synonymous with wealth and power. The difference between Sidon and Tyre, both neighboring cities and both mentioned in the prophetic texts, is that while Tyre fell abruptly and violently, Sidon bled out slowly, as if the curse pronounced by Ezekiel had been a sentence to slow agony rather than an immediate end. A form of destruction more psychological than physical, more emotional than military, but equally devastating in its consequences. Some modern historians believe that Sidon's decline was the result of geopolitical factors, bad commercial decisions, and its vulnerable position in the face of empires vying for control of the region. However, those who approach this chapter from a more spiritual or prophetic perspective cannot help but see in the history of Sidon the fulfillment of a sentence that, though seemingly unremarkable in its development, was absolutely certain in its outcome. The image of a city that, over the centuries, has been unable to regain its place of honor, that has remained on the margins of major trade routes, and has lived constantly under the shadow of its own glorious past, is perhaps one of the clearest examples of what a silent curse means. Today, those who visit Sidon can walk through the old sea castle, contemplate the historic souk, and observe the layers of civilization superimposed on one another, as if the very ground itself were trying to tell, in its own way, the story of a fall that no one could stop. And among those ancient stones, through the forgotten passageways and the tombs resting under the dust of the centuries, remains the echo of a prophecy that, slowly but inexorably, came true without anyone being able to prevent it. Sidon and its silent curse, another chapter in those stories where time seems to work in service of words spoken long before the tragedy began to be written. The return of Israel. Throughout history, few events have been as improbable and, at the same time, as loaded with meaning as the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral land after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. What for centuries seemed like an impossible aspiration, a hope buried beneath centuries of persecution, wars, and dispersion, turned into one of the most astonishing events of the 20th century. And the most puzzling part is that this story had already been written long before it took place. The prophecies announcing the return of Israel are scattered throughout several books of the Old Testament. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, each from their own historical context, spoke of a future in which the exiled people would return to their land from all corners of the world. It was not merely a massive migration or a symbolic return. The descriptions were clear. People scattered across all nations would return to Jerusalem and its surroundings, restore their cities, and re-inhabit the fields and hills that had been in the hands of others for generations. For centuries, that promise seemed more like a poetic expression than a real possibility. Since the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, with the consequent expulsion and dispersion of the Jews by the Roman Empire, the reality of the people of Israel was one of permanent exile. Jewish communities began to settle in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and later in America. Each generation grew under the shadow of a longing that seemed more spiritual than political, the desire to return to Zion. Throughout the centuries, persecutions were a constant. The Inquisition, the pogroms in Eastern Europe, the anti-Semitic laws, and finally, the absolute horror of the Holocaust during World War II deeply marked the collective identity of the Jewish people. Each tragedy seemed to push the possibility of a real return further away. Yet, at the same time, in every prayer, in every holiday, the memory of Jerusalem remained alive, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. What makes the return of Israel considered by many as a fulfilled prophecy is not just the fact that it happened, but the almost impossible circumstances that surrounded its realization. World War I changed the political map of the Middle East. The Ottoman control, which had lasted for more than 4 centuries, came to an end. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by the British government, for the first time opened the possibility of establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Still, political resistances, tensions with the local Arab population, and the lack of international consensus made that idea seem more like a diplomatic promise than an imminent reality. But then, World War II and the systematic genocide against European Jews created unprecedented moral pressure. The need to find a definitive refuge, a safe homeland where the Jewish people could live without fear of new persecutions, became an international outcry. United Nations Resolution 181, passed in November of 1947, was the first official step toward the creation of the State of Israel. On May 14, 1948. David Ben-Gurion, in a modest room in Tel Aviv, proclaimed the independence of the State of Israel, an act that, in historical terms, was almost a challenge to destiny. Surrounded by hostile countries, with limited resources and a population that barely reached 700,000 inhabitants, the new state began its journey under the threat of immediate war. What is most extraordinary is that, from that moment on, what the prophets had described centuries earlier began to unfold almost to the letter. Jews began to return from all corners of the world. First came the survivors of the Holocaust, then the Jews from Yemen, Iraq, Morocco, Ethiopia, and later, in one of the most significant migration waves, the Jews from the Soviet Union. Each wave seemed to respond to the ancient words that spoke of a return from the four corners of the earth. The numbers are compelling. In less than 70 years, the Jewish population of Israel went from less than 1 million to over 9 million inhabitants. Cities that had been small, dusty towns began to transform into modern metropolises. Hebrew, which for centuries had been used almost exclusively as a liturgical language, became a living language, spoken in the streets, in schools, and in the media. From a historical perspective, some attempt to explain this phenomenon as the logical result of a series of political, migratory, and social processes. They argue that, given the post-war circumstances and the geopolitical context of the Middle East, the creation of Israel was a predictable outcome. But those who view this event from the perspective of the ancient prophecies find in every detail a confirmation of what had been announced centuries earlier. What adds an extra layer of mystery is the fact that the return was not easy or free of suffering. Every war, every conflict, every attack, and every failed peace process seems to be part of a process where the price of the return has been paid with blood and pain. However, the mere fact that Israel continues to exist, surviving wars in which it was on the brink of extinction, facing economic, social, and diplomatic challenges, is for many further evidence that there are forces beyond human comprehension that have played a key role in its survival. Today, Israel is a modern country with a robust economy, world-renowned technological advancements, and a military that has become one of the most capable forces on the planet. And at the same time, it remains the stage for one of the most complex territorial and religious conflicts in the contemporary world. The tension between the fulfillment of a millennial promise and the political realities of the present continues to shape the daily life of its inhabitants. For some, all this is the result of a long series of historical coincidences. For others, it is the tangible manifestation that certain prophecies, however incomprehensible they may seem, end up fulfilling themselves in an inevitable way, defying the predictions of politicians, military leaders, and experts in international relations. The return of Israel to its ancestral land is not just another chapter in modern history. It is an open wound, a constant celebration, and a living reminder that, at times, time seems to fold upon itself to shape what, for centuries, only existed in the dreams and written words of ancient visionaries. Sodom, fire from the sky. To speak of Sodom is to instantly evoke one of the most shocking and terrifying stories of antiquity. A tale that has transcended generations, becoming synonymous with moral decay, divine punishment, and total destruction. The image of a city consumed by fire falling from the sky has been etched in the collective memory of humanity, passed down from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, until it became a universal symbol of the final judgment. But what few know is that, in recent times, archaeology and science have begun to find clues suggesting that behind the legend could lie a real event, a catastrophic phenomenon that happened exactly as described. The story, according to the biblical account found in the book of Genesis, places us in the Jordan Plain, near the Dead Sea, in a fertile region known for its wealth and opulence. Sodom and Gomorrah, along with other neighboring cities such as Admah and Zeboim, were part of a prosperous area, envied by many. Ancient texts describe a place where trade, agriculture, and social life flourished, but where, according to prophetic accounts, moral corruption had reached unsustainable levels. The account of the destruction is brief but forceful. Then the Lord rained sulfur and fire from the heavens upon Sodom and Gomorrah, a phrase that, for centuries, was interpreted as a metaphor for divine punishment, or at best, as a symbolic narrative meant to warn of the consequences of deviating human behavior. However, in recent decades, archaeological finds in the region have begun to take an unexpected turn in this story. At the site known as Tal el-Hammam, northeast of the Dead Sea, an archaeological team led by Stephen Collins has conducted excavations that have left both the scientific and religious communities completely baffled. The layers of sediments found at the site show evidence of sudden and extreme destruction, with unmistakable signs of exposure to temperatures that exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. The remains of buildings, collapsed as though struck by an explosive force, and the presence of vitrified material on the ground suggest that the city was obliterated in a matter of seconds. What is most disturbing is that laboratory analyses detected anomalous concentrations of salts and molten metals in the area, something that could only be explained by a high-energy event. Hypotheses began to emerge. Could it have been an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, or perhaps a cosmic impact, such as a meteorite or asteroid strike, similar to the one that occurred in Tunguska in 1908. The most recent study, published in 2021 by a multidisciplinary team of scientists, points precisely to that last possibility. According to their findings, approximately 3,600 years ago, a large object from space exploded in the atmosphere just above the region of Tal el-Hammam. The shockwave, similar to a nuclear detonation, would have generated temperatures so extreme that it caused the instant combustion of organic matter, the fusion of materials, and the complete destruction of all structures. The similarity to the biblical account is, to say the least, unsettling. A rain of fire falling from the sky, the total annihilation of a city, the ground covered in salt and ashes. Everything fits too precisely to be ignored. Additionally, archaeological records show that after this catastrophic event, the region remained uninhabited for over 600 years, something that also aligns with the idea of a prolonged curse over that land. But the connection to Sodom is not only geographical or material. In the Genesis account, it is described how Lot's wife, one of the few survivors of the tragedy, turned into a pillar of salt as she looked back while fleeing. This detail, which for centuries was considered a literary device, takes on new meaning when one considers that the shockwave may have carried large amounts of salt from the Dead Sea into the valley, covering the ground and forming deposits that, in the eyes of the ancient inhabitants, would have appeared as visible physical punishments. The most skeptical critics argue that the exact identification of Tal el-Hammam as ancient Sodom is still under debate, that conclusive evidence is lacking, and that the chronology, though generally consistent, still needs refinement. However, even accepting these reservations, what no one can deny is that the event that occurred in that region was real, devastating, and of a magnitude that perfectly matches what was described by ancient sources. The scientific discussion has opened new questions about how many other accounts considered mythological or symbolic could have a physical and tangible background. The idea that a large-scale astronomical event may have marked not only the landscape, but also the cultural memory of an entire region, adds a surprising nuance to the story of Sodom. Beyond geological or astronomical explanations, the emotional impact of this story remains the same. The image of a city that, in a matter of seconds, went from daily life to total annihilation remains as a universal warning. No matter which interpretation one chooses, religious or scientific, the final outcome is the same. A city erased by fire and transformed into an eternal symbol of punishment and human fragility. Today, when one traverses the plains east of the Jordan and observes the barren and silent landscape, It is easy to imagine the moment when the sky opened to unleash its fury upon the inhabitants of that place. The fire from the sky left a scar that time, thousands of years later, has still not completely erased. The Agony of Herod. The figure of Herod the Great has always been surrounded by a kind of dark fascination. An implacable ruler, obsessive builder, ruthless politician, and central figure in one of the most well-known stories in the New Testament. His name, for many, is forever linked to the Massacre of the Innocents, the episode in which he ordered the killing of all male children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem, fearing that among them would be the future King of the Jews, who, according to the wise men of the East, would dethrone him. However, beyond his ruthless reputation, there is a chapter of his life that stands out for its unsettling nature and its symbolism. His terrible agony, a slow and painful death that, according to many scholars, seems to be shrouded in the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, and a kind of punishment that was foretold long before his suffering began. To understand the extent of what occurred, we must first go back to the time when Herod ruled with an iron fist. He governed Judea under the backing of Rome, maintaining a relationship of constant tension with the Jewish people, who never fully accepted his authority. Herod was not a direct descendant of David, nor of the ancient royal houses of Israel. He came from Idumea, a region historically hostile to Judea, which for many of his contemporaries already represented a stain of illegitimacy that could not be erased. From the beginning of his reign, Herod was known for his paranoia. Any slightest indication of betrayal or threat was enough to unleash his fury. He ordered the execution of several of his own children, murdered his wife Mariamne, and eliminated dozens of political and religious figures he considered a danger to his throne. His relationship with the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Jewish Council, was a continuous back and forth of manipulations, blackmail, and repression. In this context of violence and oppression, voices began to emerge from the prophetic realm, warning that Herod's end would be an exemplary punishment. It was not just a symbolic message of poetic justice. There was talk of a physical, prolonged agony, marked by bodily suffering and the total degradation of his body. The description of his death, detailed by the historian Flavius Josephus, is especially disturbing. According to his chronicles, in the final months of his life, Herod was consumed by an illness that, for the medicine of his time, had no cure or clear explanation. His body began to decompose while still alive. He suffered from constant fevers, intense abdominal spasms, difficulty breathing, and most disturbingly, open sores on his skin that emitted an unbearable stench. The doctors of the time, unable to alleviate his suffering, resorted to all kinds of desperate treatments, including special oil baths, steam inhalations, and rudimentary surgical procedures. But each attempt seemed to worsen his condition. Gangrene began to spread through his limbs. The infection advanced uncontrollably. The accumulation of fluids in his body caused edema that deformed his physical appearance. His skin took on dark hues. His cries of pain, according to witnesses of the time, could be heard from the palace corridors, even during moments of his greatest isolation. Herod's desperation reached such a point that, in a fit of madness and fear, he ordered the imprisonment of the chief leaders of Jerusalem. His plan, in an act of calculated cruelty, was for them to be executed at the exact moment of his death, ensuring that, even though the people hated him, there would be weeping and mourning in Jerusalem when he passed away. Fortunately, his successors did not carry out this final order. But the mere existence of this plan reflects the level of psychological deterioration he reached during his last days. When death finally reached him, Herod was little more than a shadow of the monarch he had once been. His body was consumed, deformed, covered in purulent wounds, and utterly unrecognizable. The modern forensic autopsy, based on the descriptions of Flavius Josephus and other ancient texts, suggests that he may have suffered from a combination of diseases such as chronic renal failure, Fournier's gangrene, and an advanced form of bacterial infection that led to widespread septicemia. From a historical perspective, Herod's death is the sad outcome of a life marked by abuse of power, violence, and betrayal. However, when viewed through the prophetic context, the picture takes on an even more unsettling tone. Some theologians believe that the physical punishment he endured is a direct consequence of his role in the events related to the birth of Jesus. The massacre of the innocents, for example, is seen as the moral breaking point that sealed his fate. It is impossible not to draw parallels between his suffering and the words of warning that circulated among the prophets and religious leaders of the time. Messages that spoke of the fall of the proud, the punishment reserved for unjust rulers, and a death that would come accompanied by pain and humiliation. Even after his death, Herod's body did not rest in peace. He was buried in one of his most ambitious constructions, the Herodium, a fortress palace located on the outskirts of Jerusalem. For centuries, his tomb remained hidden, and when it was finally rediscovered in 2007 by archaeologist Ehud Netzer, the remains found confirmed what many had already suspected. The mausoleum had been looted in ancient times, the bones were fragmented, and the site showed clear signs of intentional destruction. The final irony is that, despite all the effort he put into ensuring an eternal legacy, today Herod is remembered more for his tyranny and tragic end than for his architectural achievements. The man who expanded the Second Temple, who built the majestic fortress of Masada, and who endowed Jerusalem with some of its most emblematic structures, ended up being a symbol of the corruption of power and the price that, it seems, comes with challenging certain moral boundaries. Herod's agony was not simply a long illness. It was, in every sense, a living representation of physical suffering taken to the extreme, accompanied by emotional degradation and absolute despair. An end that, for many, was the materialization of a judgment announced long before his symptoms began to appear. Today, those who visit the ruins of the Herodium or browse through the pages of ancient chronicles cannot help but feel that, behind that slow and terrible death, there was something more than just a mere medical coincidence. A feeling that perhaps invisible hands were writing the outcome of his story long before he himself knew that his end would be one of the most painful ever known in the history of the kings of Israel. The irreversible decline of Egypt. To speak of Egypt is to speak of a civilization that, for millennia, represented the pinnacle of power, monumental architecture, and cultural sophistication. An empire that seemed immortal, one that defied time by erecting temples, obelisks, and pyramids that, even today, continue to defy logic and human understanding. But behind this image of eternal splendor, there exists a little-known prophecy, a warning that Egypt, once the master of the Nile and the African trade routes, would enter a decline from which it would never fully recover. An irreversible decline, a historical curse that, over the centuries, was fulfilled step by step, eventually reducing the country to a permanent shadow of what it once was. The prophecy, which at the time seemed politically heretical and an impossible message, was uttered by the prophet Ezekiel. In chapter 29 of his book, Ezekiel wrote that Egypt would fall into disgrace, be invaded by foreign peoples, and never rise again as a global power. The sentence went beyond a simple warning of military defeat. It spoke of a lasting punishment, a progressive degradation that would affect not only its government, but also its economy, geopolitical influence, and social stability. The message was clear. Egypt would become a weak kingdom, without any power to decide on major international issues, reduced to being a mere spectator of the conflicts it once dominated. When one observes the context in which this prophecy was announced, disbelief seems justified. Egypt was still a strong nation, respected by its neighbors, capable of mobilizing armies and influencing the decisions of nearby kingdoms. Although it was no longer the Egypt of the great pharaohs, it still maintained its political structure, agricultural wealth, and strategic position as a crossroads between Africa and Asia. But everything began to change slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. First came the Persian invasions in the 6th century before Christ, marking the beginning of an era of foreign domination. Then the Greeks arrived with Alexander the Great, who, while respecting certain aspects of Egyptian culture, introduced a system of government that placed the local population in a secondary position. Later, Rome incorporated Egypt as yet another province of its vast empire, stripping it entirely of any real autonomy. The centuries continued to accumulate, and with each change of power, Egypt seemed to sink further into its own irrelevance. The Byzantine era and the subsequent Arab conquest in the 7th century after Christ solidified a trend of political subjugation and economic decay that already seemed irreversible. Archaeologists and historians who have studied this process agree that, since the end of the Pharaonic era, Egypt has never regained its status as a global superpower. There were periods of partial recovery, moments of relative growth, but never a complete restoration of its former splendor. The country that once exported culture, religion, and technology became a land constantly invaded, looted, or administered by foreign powers. What makes this process even more unsettling is the accuracy with which the development of Egyptian history followed the pattern predicted by Ezekiel. The prophet's words were so specific that they even spoke of a period of 40 years of desolation, during which the land would be practically empty and devoid of political power. According to several scholars, this period could coincide with the Babylonian occupation and the deportation of populations during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, although the exact interpretations vary among different schools of biblical analysis. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence of demographic, economic, and military crises during that period. Remains of abandoned settlements, administrative records showing a decline in agricultural production, and testimonies of forced population displacements are just a few of the clues that confirm that something very serious happened in those years. Even after Roman domination, when Egypt became the granary of the empire, the country never regained its status as an independent power. During the Middle Ages, it was the scene of constant conflicts between Saracens, Crusaders, and Mamluks. Later, in the modern era, it became first an Ottoman protectorate, then a territory coveted by Napoleon, and finally a British protectorate. In the 20th century, after achieving formal independence, Egypt experienced political ups and downs, internal revolutions, and wars with its neighbors. But at no point did it manage to position itself as a decisive actor in world politics. Economic dependence, internal conflicts, and social instability continue to define its recent history. When one analyzes the whole picture, it is impossible not to feel that Ezekiel's prophecy has, in some way, been a sentence that has stretched out across millennia. There was no single catastrophic event, but rather a long chain of defeats, invasions, and declines that have kept Egypt in a state of perpetual relative weakness. The current situation, although different in form, still follows that same historical line. Egypt, despite its geographical size and huge population, remains a nation whose political influence on the global stage is limited. Its recurring economic crises, internal security problems, and its role as a mere mediator in external conflicts reinforce the sense that the country remains trapped in the cycle of the prophecy. From a more rationalist perspective, some argue that Egypt's decline was the logical consequence of geopolitical, technological, and commercial changes. The opening of new maritime routes, the rise of other regional powers, and the evolution of military systems made Egypt obsolete in the face of new challenges. However, when comparing the real history with the words spoken by Ezekiel over 2,500 years ago, it becomes impossible not to feel that there is something more. A kind of preordained script that history, for reasons beyond our understanding, has insisted on following to the letter. Today, the pyramids still stand. The temples of Luxor and Karnak still welcome visitors, and the Nile River continues its course toward the Mediterranean. But behind the archaeological beauty, Egypt remains, just as it was predicted, a country that has never been able to return to what it once was. A giant turned into a silent witness to its own fall, whose history, no matter how much it tries to revive, seems to continue following a prophecy that to this day remains valid. The Great Earthquake of Jerusalem. There are events that mark a city forever, occurrences that are etched into stone, into collective memory, and in ancient texts as warnings that, at certain moments, the earth itself seems to react to the emotional, spiritual, or historical burden it carries. Jerusalem, that epicenter of religions, conflicts, and hope, witnessed over 2,700 years ago an earthquake that not only shook its physical foundations, but also the consciousness of its inhabitants. An event that, according to records, was so devastating that its memory was immortalized both in archaeology and in the pages of the Bible. The first reference to this great earthquake appears in the book of Amos. A prophet who lived in the 8th century before Christ, Amos, whose mission was to denounce social injustice and religious hypocrisy of his time, began his message with a phrase that, at the time, must have frozen the blood of those who heard it. 2 years before the earthquake. A form of dating that reveals the magnitude of the event, as if, from that day, the history of the region was divided into a before and after. The earthquake occurred during the reign of Uzziah, king of Judah, a period that, up until that point, had been relatively stable, with moderate economic growth and some political peace. Life in Jerusalem continued its course between temple routines, markets, and royal palace decisions. But everything changed abruptly and unexpectedly. Later testimonies, both in the book of Zechariah and in other Hebrew texts, describe how the population fled in terror, seeking refuge in the mountains, while the earth opened beneath their feet and the sturdiest structures collapsed like sandcastles. For centuries, many considered the account of the great earthquake of Jerusalem to be part of the symbolic language of the prophets, a literary exaggeration meant to give dramatic effect to their moral warnings. However, modern archaeology has proven that the earthquake not only occurred, but was one of the most devastating to have shaken the region in its known history. Excavations carried out in the city of David and other archaeological sites in Jerusalem have revealed layers of destruction dating back to the mid-8th century BC. The remains show walls suddenly collapsed, structures fractured in typical seismic patterns, and clear signs of an unexpected collapse that affected both public buildings and private homes. What is most striking is that this same layer of destruction has been found in other cities of Judah and Israel, such as Hazor, Gezer, and Lachish. The magnitude of the event was such that the seismic wave left traces across more than 300 kilometers. Geologists who have studied the tectonic fault of the Jordan Valley agree that Uzziah's earthquake was likely one of the strongest recorded in the region's history, with an estimated magnitude that could have exceeded 7 on the Richter scale. The psychological impact it left on the population was so profound that even centuries later, it was still remembered. The prophet Zechariah, writing more than 200 years later, makes direct reference to that event when he warns that, in the future, a day of final judgment would be as terrifying as that great earthquake in the days of Uzziah. A detail that reveals that the collective memory of the disaster remained alive long after it occurred. From a more spiritual perspective, some scholars interpret this earthquake as a physical manifestation of a moment of moral and religious crisis in Jerusalem. Amos, like other prophets of his time, constantly denounced social inequality, corruption, and the hypocrisy of those leading the temple worship. The coincidence between his warnings and the sudden appearance of a natural disaster of such magnitude has led many to consider that the earthquake was more than just a geological phenomenon. Even today, when walking through the underground tunnels of ancient Jerusalem, guides often point out the structural damage still visible on some walls, attributed to that earthquake. Cracks running through millennia-old stones, blocks displaced from their original alignment, subtle yet persistent marks that continue to speak, silently but powerfully, of a day when the entire city trembled. Beyond archaeology and geology, what is particularly unsettling is how this episode became intertwined with prophetic language. From then on, the image of the earthquake as a symbol of divine punishment or moral purification began to appear recurrently in Hebrew texts. The idea that the earth itself could be used as an instrument of correction for a disobedient people became a central theme in the sacred literature of the time. The coincidence between the biblical account, archaeological evidence, and current geological studies makes the Great Earthquake of Jerusalem one of those examples where history, religion, and science seem to speak the same language. Every layer of earth removed by archaeologists, every stone out of place, every chronicle written on parchment, all add to the construction of a narrative that, for its symbolic power and physical impact, continues to evoke fascination and awe among those who study it. Today, centuries after that tremor, Jerusalem remains a city accustomed to living under tension, not only because of its current political and religious conflicts, but also because, geologically, it sits atop an active seismic fault. Seismologists warn that, at any moment, a similar event to Uzziah's time could occur again. The question that lingers in the air is whether, if a catastrophe like that were to repeat itself, the city would interpret it as just another natural phenomenon, or as a new sign that in some way, Jerusalem continues to be that place where history and the supernatural always seem to walk hand in hand. The announced death of Jezebel. There are names in history that seem to be wrapped in a permanent shadow, figures who, although they were real, ended up becoming symbols of moral decay, political manipulation, and silent violence. Jezebel is undoubtedly one of those names. Her story is not only that of a foreign queen who ascended to the throne of Israel through marriage alliance, but also that of a woman whose fate was marked long before her end was written on the streets of Jezreel. Her life and death were the embodiment of a prophecy that, years before its fulfillment, already resonated from the mouths of prophets with a clarity that remains chilling to this day. To understand the extent of her fall, we must begin at the beginning. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, a Phoenician nation that revered Baal and Astarte as their principal deities. When she married King Ahab, monarch of the northern kingdom of Israel, she brought with her not only her royal lineage, but also an entire religious and cultural worldview that clashed head-on with Hebrew traditions. From the moment she came to power, Jezebel exerted a devastating influence on the political and spiritual apparatus of Israel. She promoted the worship of Baal, persecuted the prophets of Yahweh, and did not hesitate to use murder as a tool to consolidate her power. One of the most well-known episodes was the murder of Naboth, a humble farmer whose vineyard was coveted by King Ahab. Jezebel orchestrated a false accusation, manipulated local authorities, and had Naboth unjustly executed so her husband could seize the land. It was precisely after this act of injustice that the prophet Elijah, one of the most feared and respected of his time, pronounced the sentence that would forever mark Jezebel's destiny. In a direct message, without adornments or metaphors, Elijah announced that dogs would lick Ahab's blood and that, in the case of Jezebel, her body would be devoured by dogs in the square of Jezreel. A public condemnation, unthinkable in an era when defying royalty meant playing with one's life. What is chilling about this prophecy is how, despite the time that passed between its announcement and fulfillment, every word ended up materializing literally. Jezebel's fall was a process that simmered slowly, fueled by her husband's political errors, wrong alliances, and the growing discontent of a people weary of corruption and abuse of power. After Ahab's death and the brief and bloody succession of his sons, Jehu, a military commander who had been anointed king by an anonymous prophet, appeared on the scene. He embarked on a campaign to eradicate the Omri dynasty and all worshippers of Baal. His march toward Jezreel was swift and determined. News of his arrival spread like wildfire across the kingdom, sowing terror in the palace where Jezebel, now a widow and aging, still held influence. The account of her death is one of the most visual and dramatic passages in the entire Old Testament. Upon learning that Jehu was coming to the city, Jezebel, rather than hiding or fleeing, painted her eyes, styled her hair, and looked out the window, defiantly throwing one last verbal provocation at the new king. Her gesture has been interpreted in many ways, as a display of dignity in the face of the inevitable, as a desperate attempt at seduction, or as a final expression of arrogance. But none of these attitudes changed what was about to happen. Jehu, without wasting a second, ordered the eunuchs accompanying her to throw her out of the window. The fall was brutal. Jezebel's body struck the ground violently, and according to the biblical text, her blood splattered on the wall and on Jehu's horses, who trampled her without remorse as they continued their march. As if violent death were not enough, the most terrifying part came afterward. When Jehu, after a brief rest, ordered the queen's body to be buried, following at least a minimal protocol of respect for her status as a king's daughter, the servants who went to retrieve her remains found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Almost nothing remained of Jezebel. Only her skull, feet, and palms were left. The dogs of the city, those very same animals mentioned years earlier by the prophet Elijah, had carried out the second part of the prophecy with precision. This detail, seemingly macabre, carries a symbolic weight that has been the subject of analysis for centuries. The parts of the body that were missing were precisely those associated with the queen's pride and power. Her face, with which she seduced and manipulated; her body, a symbol of her authority; and her hands, instruments of so many bloody decisions. The final image Jezebel left behind was one of total destruction, absolute humiliation, and the fulfillment of a sentence that seemed to have been written by destiny itself. From a historical perspective, some researchers consider that Jezebel's death reflects the political practices of the time, where power shifts were often accompanied by extreme acts of violence. Others analyze the account from a literary standpoint, as an example of poetic justice in biblical narrative. But even under these more rationalist approaches, it is difficult to ignore the precise sequence of events that led to the exact materialization of every detail foretold by Elijah. The case of Jezebel remains, now more than ever, a disturbing example of how the abuse of power and contempt for justice ultimately take their toll, even on those who believe themselves untouchable. Her figure, transformed into a universal symbol of corruption and moral fall, continues to appear as a reference in religious texts, plays, and studies on political leadership. As one walks through the plains of Jezreel, where her blood stained the earth and where her remains were scattered by street animals, it is impossible not to reflect on the weight of the written word, on the power of prophecy, and on the certainty that, when history and destiny decide to unite, no throne or makeup can save those who have spent years defying the consequences of their own actions. The end of the Philistines. For centuries, the name of the Philistines evoked fear in the lands of Canaan. A people who mastered the art of war, who repeatedly challenged Israel, and who built fortified cities along the Mediterranean coastal strip. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron were the 5 pillars of a military confederation that seemed indestructible. The image of their warriors, armed with iron swords when other people still fought with bronze weapons, became a symbol of constant threat. But behind this power was a fate that, although ignored for generations, eventually came to pass with a precision that continues to surprise even the most skeptical historians. The Bible, in various passages from the prophetic books, issues a series of warnings against the Philistines, which at the time were considered exaggerations. Jeremiah, Amos, Zephaniah, and Ezekiel all share the same message. The Philistine cities would fall one by one, be swept off the map, and their people would eventually disappear to the point where their very identity would be erased from history. A punishment announced not only for their conflicts with Israel, but also for their arrogance, their brutality in war, and their contempt for other peoples. Throughout the Iron Age, the Philistines were central to some of the most epic confrontations in the region. The battle between David and Goliath, perhaps one of the most emblematic stories, reflects the constant tension between Israel and Philistia. However, beyond the most well-known biblical episodes, there were military campaigns that brought the Philistines to their greatest territorial expansion and economic power. For much of the first millennium before Christ, they controlled important trade routes, and their ports were key for the exchange of goods between Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. But the cycle of civilization seems to always follow an inevitable pattern. The fall of Philistia began gradually, like a slow territorial hemorrhage. First came the Assyrian campaigns. During the 8th century before Christ, the armies of Tiglath-Pileser III and later those of Sennacherib swept through several Philistine cities, leaving behind a landscape of ruins and death. The Assyrian chronicles describe in detail the brutality of their campaigns. The walls of Ashdod and Ekron were torn down. Thousands of inhabitants were deported, and local leaders were publicly executed to serve as a lesson. The Philistines, though accustomed to war, could never fully recover from those blows. The population began to decline. The culture, which had once been vibrant and distinctive, began to fade as successive waves of invaders imposed new customs, languages, and systems of governance. The final blow came with the expansion of the Babylonian Empire. In 586 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar, the same king who destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the Jewish people, directed his armies toward the coast. The Philistine cities were the next target. Gaza, the last great fortress, fell after a brutal siege. The survivors were deported or forced to flee to Egypt and other southern regions. The rest of the Philistine cities were reduced to rubble. What is most intriguing is that, unlike other conquered peoples, the Philistines left no continuity. Their culture did not evolve into a new stage under Babylonian or Persian rule. They simply disappeared. Their customs, their language, and their ethnic identity dissolved to the point that, barely 2 centuries later, no mention of them as an independent people could be found in historical records. Modern archaeology has confirmed this process of abrupt disappearance. Excavations in Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ashdod show layers of destruction corresponding to the periods of Assyrian and Babylonian invasion. In the upper layers, there are no traces of Philistine pottery, architecture, or inscriptions. Only evidence of the cultures that came after, such as the Persian and Greek. Recent genetic studies, published since 2019, have managed to recover fragments of DNA from human remains found in ancient Philistine cemeteries. The results revealed that the Philistines probably arrived from the Aegean to the Levant around the 12th century before Christ. But beyond this fact, what is most striking is the sudden disappearance of any Philistine genetic trace in later generations. A biological piece of evidence that supports what the biblical texts and contemporary chronicles had already indicated. The Philistine people were absorbed or completely eliminated. Some experts in biblical studies have pointed out that the prophecy regarding the end of the Philistines was not just a political or military condemnation, but a warning about arrogance and unchecked violence. The message seemed clear. No power, no matter how strong it feels, is exempt from falling and being forgotten if its power is based on abuse and injustice. Today, the term Philistine survives in modern language, but more as a cultural adjective than as an ethnic reference. Its pejorative use to describe someone uncultured or rude has little to do with the people who once built fortified cities and challenged Israel for generations. When one walks along the coasts of what is now the Gaza Strip and part of southern Israel, there are barely any visible traces of that civilization. Some isolated ruins, fragments of pottery, and remnants of forgotten walls among the dunes and vegetation. The great Philistia, which for centuries was a key player in the region's politics, ended up fulfilling, step by step, each of the words that the prophets spoke against it. The case of the Philistines is perhaps one of the clearest and most dramatic examples of how an entire people can disappear not only from the maps, but from the active memory of humanity, relegated to ancient texts and archaeological excavations. A silent warning that the arrogance of nations, no matter how solid they seem, always has a limit that sooner or later arrives. The curse of Ammon and its lost city. When discussing the ancient enemies of Israel, it is inevitable to think of names such as Moab, Edom, or Philistia. But there is another kingdom, less known to the general public, that played a key role in the political, military, and spiritual tensions of the region: Ammon. A territory that for centuries was a symbol of resistance, nationalist pride, and an enmity that seemed to have no end. Its capital, Rabbah of the children of Ammon, was once a fortified, prosperous city, located at a strategic point on the trade routes connecting the desert to the Jordan Valley. Today, its approximate location is associated with the area where the modern city of Amman, Jordan, stands. But the ancient Rabbah, that remains lost, shrouded in a veil of mystery that archaeology has only just begun to decipher. The prophecies against Ammon are neither few nor mild. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos dedicated lengthy passages warning about the fate awaiting this people. The condemnation was clear: total destruction, abandonment, perpetual ruin, and the final displacement of its population. But there was also an especially disturbing element: the transformation of its city into a desolate land, where the echo of human voices would be replaced by the howling of the wind through the ruins and the presence of wild animals as the only reminder of its past existence. The enmity between Ammon and Israel had deep roots. During the period of the Judges and later under the unified monarchy, the Ammonites participated in numerous military raids against Israelite territory. Their involvement in the fall of Judah, allying with Babylon, and celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem was one of the reasons why the Hebrew prophets spoke so harshly against them. The image of a people who not only rejoiced in others' misfortune but actively collaborated in it became ingrained in Israel's historical memory. The fall of Ammon, like that of other kingdoms in the region, was not the work of a single army or a single military campaign. It was a prolonged process, marked by successive defeats, forced migrations, and an inability to adapt to the new geopolitical orders. The Assyrians first, the Babylonians later, and finally the Persians, gradually encircled the Ammonite territory until it became irrelevant. But what truly stands out is the near-total disappearance of Ammon's cultural identity. Unlike other neighboring peoples, who were assimilated but left a clear trace of their existence in tradition, language, or in the genetics of current populations, the Ammonites seem to have vanished from the map in a way that is unsettling. Historical sources after the Persian period scarcely mention them. Their customs, language, and symbols dissolved over time without leaving clear heirs. Archaeology, although it has managed to identify remains of ancient Rabbah, has barely managed to reconstruct partial fragments of its material history. Excavations in the area of modern-day Ammon have revealed sections of walls, some tombs, and pottery fragments. But what is most striking is the documentary void surrounding this ancient kingdom. There are no administrative records, nor Ammonite religious texts that have survived. The scarcity of inscriptions means that, even today, researchers depend almost exclusively on external sources, primarily biblical and Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles, to reconstruct the history of Ammon. This absence of written records is precisely one of the elements that most troubles scholars. How is it possible that a people who for centuries played a significant role in regional politics left so few traces? Some archaeologists argue that the systematic destruction of their archives and temples was part of a punishment policy by the invading empires. Others suggest that the Ammonite elites, after being defeated, emigrated to safer regions and eventually adopted the languages and customs of their new hosts. From a theological perspective, many see in this historical void the confirmation of the literal fulfillment of the prophecies. The curse of Ammon spoke not only of physical destruction, but also of a progressive oblivion, a disappearance that would even reach their collective memory. The idea of a city turned into a desolate land and a people without recognizable descendants continues to generate debate among historians, archaeologists, and religious scholars. The current city of Ammon, although built on the ancient site of Rabbah, has very little in common with its predecessor. Modernity has covered with layers of cement and asphalt what were once palaces, temples, and markets. Only in some archaeological sectors, such as the citadel, can fragments of stone be seen that recall a much more distant past. But even there, the Ammonite identity is almost a whisper, a presence that is perceived more by its absence than by its material evidence. The case of Ammon and its lost city is one of those episodes where archaeology and ancient prophecies meet in a kind of silent dialogue. Every layer of earth removed, every ceramic fragment found, seems to confirm that there was a time when a proud people walked those streets, and then disappeared forever, as if history had decided to close that chapter once and for all. Today, as archaeologists continue to explore the region and scholars review ancient texts in search of new clues, the mystery of Ammon and its lost city remains one of the most unsettling enigmas of the ancient Levant. A land condemned to oblivion, a culture silenced by the centuries, and a prophecy that, word by word, seems to have found its fulfillment in the dust and forgotten stones of a hill that, once, was the heart of a kingdom. The punishment of lost Babylon. Talking about Babylon is to delve into the history of one of the most powerful and iconic empires of antiquity. It was a city that for centuries represented the height of architectural, military, and cultural splendor in the known world. Its hanging gardens were listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and its walls, of almost legendary thickness and height, seemed to defy any attempt at conquest. Chronicles speak of its majestic temples, of its ziggurats rising into the sky, of its monumental gates covered in reliefs, narrating victories and tributes to the gods. But behind that splendor, there existed a warning written centuries before Babylon's fall could even be imagined. A prophecy that spoke of its total destruction and of a punishment so profound that it would render the city uninhabitable, condemned to remain desolate for generations. The prophetic texts of the Old Testament, especially in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Revelation, construct a devastating portrait of Babylon's fate. The words are clear, with no ambiguities. The city would be reduced to ruins, its palaces abandoned, its streets deserted, and its fields turned into the dwelling place of wild animals and ghosts. The image of an eternal Babylon would be replaced by that of a cursed land, covered in dust and silence. For centuries, these warnings seemed improbable. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon reached a level of splendor that no other kingdom in the region could match. Military conquests, such as the fall of Jerusalem and the deportation of its inhabitants, reinforced the image of an invincible empire. The canal system and gardens, the flourishing trade, and cultural production turned Babylon into a model that seemed destined to endure. However, history had prepared a very different outcome. The first sign of change came with the Persian conquest. In 539 before Common Era, Cyrus the Great, without the need for an open battle, took the city almost without resistance. The account of this event, recorded in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, shows how the Persian army entered peacefully. But from that moment onward, the decline of Babylon began, slowly but inexorably. The Persians, though allowing the city to continue functioning as an administrative center, diverted political and economic attention to Persepolis and other regions of their empire. The importance of Babylon began to fade. Later, under Alexander the Great, there was an attempt to restore its former glory. Alexander himself dreamed of making Babylon the capital of his vast empire. But his sudden death in the city, in 323 before Common Era, seemed to seal that project's fate. After Alexander, Babylon was relegated to a secondary role. The gradual silting of the Euphrates River, changes in trade routes, and administrative abandonment caused the population to begin migrating. Over the decades, the city, once the heart of the Mesopotamian world, began to crumble, both literally and symbolically. The most surprising thing is that this process coincided, step by step, with the prophetic description. The book of Jeremiah, for example, predicted that Babylon would become a heap of ruins, a haunt for jackals, an object of horror and hissing without inhabitants. Modern archaeology, which has explored the ruins of Babylon for over a century, confirms that, indeed, the city remained uninhabited for centuries. Excavations have revealed large areas covered with rubble, dry canals, collapsed temples, and streets buried under centuries of dust and sand. Even in later times, when the Arabs conquered Mesopotamia, Babylon remained forgotten. During the Middle Ages, hardly anyone knew its exact location. Travelers passing near its ruins spoke of mounds covered in weeds and local legends that described the place as cursed. Islamic texts from the time mention Babylon with fear, as a city under an ancient curse. Today, walking through the ruins, what stands out the most is the absolute silence that seems to envelop everything. Despite some modern attempts to restore small sections, such as the controversial reconstructions ordered by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, the general feeling the place transmits is one of abandonment and desolation. The reconstructed structures only serve to underscore the contrast with the original areas, where the destruction is complete. Attempts to repopulate the area or turn it into a large-scale tourist center have failed again and again. Climatic conditions, logistical difficulties, and, according to some locals, a kind of inexplicable unease that invades those who try to settle nearby, have prevented Babylon from becoming continuously inhabited again. From a historical standpoint, some attribute the fall and abandonment of Babylon to geographical, economic, or strategic causes. The natural diversion of the Euphrates River, the rise of new political capitals, and transformations in global trade routes are factors that undoubtedly contributed. But even accepting these explanations, it is unsettling how all these factors seem to have worked together to fulfill a prophecy pronounced centuries before the first brick began to crack. Today, Babylon remains as a physical testimony to the passage of time and the fragility of empires. A silent warning that neither architectural glory nor military power are enough to guarantee permanence. The city that was once synonymous with splendor, science, astronomy, and art now lies transformed into a landscape of scattered ruins, roads covered in dust, and structures that barely withstand the ravages of centuries. The punishment of Babylon was not only the fall of its walls or the disappearance of its people. It was a condemnation to historical invisibility, the loss of influence, and the transformation of a symbol of power into an eternal example that arrogance, when it challenges certain limits, always comes with a price. The Mystery of Damascus. Damascus, the city of 1,000 names and 1,000 stories, a place where time seems to walk in crossed directions, where the desert sand blends with the murmur of ancient legends, and where every street encloses layers upon layers of civilizations, empires, and conflicts. Speaking of Damascus is speaking of one of the oldest urban centers in the world, a place that has seen pharaohs, Babylonian kings, Greek conquerors, Roman legions, Islamic armies, and modern forces pass by. But beyond its tangible history, there is an element that surrounds this city with an air of mystery that stretches across the centuries. A prophecy warning that Damascus will be reduced to a pile of ruins, uninhabited and abandoned forever. A fate that, for centuries, has seemed to elude, but whose shadow still looms over its future. The most well-known warning about the end of Damascus is found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 17, where the prophet bluntly declares that Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. A sweeping statement that, like many other biblical prophecies, has fueled debates among theologians, historians, and archaeologists for generations. What makes this case especially intriguing is that, unlike many other ancient cities condemned by similar prophecies, Damascus has never experienced the absolute and definitive destruction described in the texts. It has endured sieges, been conquered and devastated multiple times, but it has always managed to rise again, remain inhabited, and preserve its identity as a living city. Even after wars, epidemics, and recent conflicts, Damascus continues to be a populated capital, with streets full of people, functioning markets, and daily activity that seems to defy what was written. Throughout its history, Damascus has been the scene of numerous episodes of violence and destruction. In the 8th century before Christ, it was conquered by the Assyrians under the command of Tiglath-Pileser III. Later, during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, it passed through different hands, undergoing urban, cultural, and religious transformations. In the Middle Ages, the Crusades and the Mongol campaigns once again subjected it to fire and pillage. Even in modern times, during the Syrian civil war, Damascus became the target of bombings and clashes that caused significant damage to its historical center and its peripheral neighborhoods. And yet there it stands, a stubborn survivor, a kind of historical anomaly that resists following the script that seemed to have been written more than 2,500 years ago. This fact has led to all kinds of interpretations. Some believe that the prophecy was partially fulfilled during the Assyrian invasions, when the city lost its political independence and was reduced to a state of vassalage that left it in ruins for a time. Others suggest that the fulfillment is still to come, that what Isaiah described corresponds to a future event that has yet to happen, and that at some point, a natural disaster, a military conflict, or internal collapse will lead Damascus to its prophesied fate. From the field of archaeology, the layers of destruction beneath the city are undeniable. Excavations in the ancient area have revealed remains of fires, architectural collapses, and successive reconstructions. However, none of those destructions were definitive. There was always a phase of rebirth, of reconstruction. People returned, repopulated, rebuilt temples, mosques, markets, and homes. This capacity for rebirth has made Damascus an exception within the pattern followed by other cities in the region that did become deserted and forgotten. Some scholars, in an attempt to reconcile the prophecy with the current reality, have suggested that the expression "will be in ruins" should be interpreted in a more symbolic or spiritual sense. According to this line of thought, the true collapse of Damascus would have been moral, cultural, or political, rather than physical. An argument that, while interesting, does not satisfy those who expect a literal manifestation of the prophecy. From a more pragmatic perspective, other researchers point out that the risk of total destruction is still real and tangible. The location of Damascus, in a region marked by permanent political tensions, makes it a vulnerable target in any large-scale conflict. The presence of chemical weapons, intermittent bombings, and the proximity of armed groups make many wonder if, after all this time, the prophecy could suddenly come true in the near future. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this mystery is the way the city itself seems to live under a kind of silent countdown. The scars left by each conflict are visible, in its streets, on its walls, and in the faces of its inhabitants. Each new episode of violence that affects the region reactivates the questions, doubts, and discussions about whether the end of Damascus is closer than it seems. Today, walking through the Al-Hamidiyya Souk, strolling next to the great mosque of the Umayyads, or losing oneself in the alleys of the Christian quarter is an experience that mixes beauty and melancholy. The feeling that you are in a city that defies fate, that seems to survive by pure whim of time, but that at the same time walks on the edge of a prediction that has been haunting it for centuries. The mystery of Damascus remains open. The city stands, but the shadow of the prophecy lingers, like a warning suspended in the air. A kind of hourglass that seems frozen, but could drop its last grain at any moment. Meanwhile, people continue to live, love, pray, and die in its streets, as if ignoring the weight of the past were the only way to resist a future that, according to some texts written almost 3,000 years ago, is already decided. History spoke, time fulfilled, and the mystery is as alive as ever. If this journey through fulfilled prophecies has left you thinking, I invite you to share it. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the upcoming stories that, like this one, challenge all logic. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through time and the inevitable. We will hear from each other very soon. Good night.